Hey everyone, Dr. Nathan Notwa here, Fantasy Docs. You might have seen me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Usually I go through in-season injury histories on NFL athletes. I'm a board-certified sports medicine physician with experience treating high-level collegiate and professional athletes. So now that we are reaching the end of the season, I'm planning on going through some long-term prognosis for about 30 NFL players that people have expressed a strong interest in. So hopefully you enjoy the comments and let me know what questions you might have at the end. We're going to start off with Chris Godwin. Also, timestamps are in the description if you want to jump back and forth between players. But Chris Godwin, he ended up having an ankle dislocation last season. He had a fractured fibula, and he also had a high ligament injury. We talked about that extensively in my shorts about the long-term prognosis of that. With ankle dislocations, there's different degrees of them. So you can have up to 3 kinds of fractures where you have it on one side of the ankle, both sides of the ankle, or both sides of the ankle and the back part of the ankle, called unimal, bimal, and trimal fractures. Basically, Chris Godwin seemed to have a unimal fracture, which is the best kind of outcome, and he has returned back to play this season. He hasn't put up stellar fantasy football numbers, but he has been getting targeted, and I think he is slowly ramping up. And he should be a good hold dynasty-wise or a good target in redraft purposes next season, as he will likely be a little bit lower in the list just based on his performance this season. J.K. Dobbins, really unfortunate. We can only imagine kind of how Dobbins would have done if he didn't have any injuries, because even this past season, he was doing really well. And that was with having history of an Achilles tendon tear, which is an insane injury for an NFL running back, to be honest, and then also an ACL repair. But unfortunately, this season, he, in addition to that, had a Lisfranc injury. Lisfranc injuries are midfoot fractures, where basically the middle part of your foot, the weight-bearing part, gets fractured at a part with very little support. It is a pretty significant injury, and I would put it right up there with Achilles in terms of long-term production. Dobbins, unfortunately, has his second major career injury. I think it'll be hard for him to return from this, and I probably wouldn't be targeting Dobbins or making him a huge high priority. Unfortunate. He is an amazing player to watch, and I do wish him the best with his career. Tyreek Hill, a player who is in his 30s and had a pretty gruesome knee dislocation this season. When we say a knee dislocation, we don't just mean the kneecap popping out of place. We mean the structure of the knee that's joined together by the MCL, the ACL, the LCL, and the PCL. At least 3 of those ligaments getting injured and the actual knee joint coming out of place. This is considered a surgical emergency because there is blood vessels there that, if they're ruptured, can cause necrosis and cause a need for amputation or even death in rare cases. When it's happening on an NFL field, there's a ton of people watching, all this kind of stuff. Very rare that it would progress to those severe outcomes, but something that needs to be addressed right away and stabilized right away. So with Tyreek Hill, unfortunately with knee dislocations, it's a very severe injury, and only 33% of players, regardless of age, return back to pre-injury performance. Tyreek Hill already wasn't doing super well. He had some other wrist injuries that were going on, limiting his production, scapulae ligament injury that really kind of affects grip strength, all that kind of stuff. With this knee injury, the biggest thing about Tyreek is his speed, and this is really going to affect his burst speed. I don't see him being viable for fantasy, unfortunately, going forward. He might return back, but I don't. I think there's a real risk of him retiring at this point in time and not returning back to the NFL. With knee dislocations, also something else you have to watch out for. It's pretty much the universal onset of arthritis. So that is going to happen with a lot of injuries. Almost all these injuries increase your risk of post-traumatic arthritis, is what they call it. And this is no exception to that. Moving on to another player who also had a knee dislocation as well, as was Tank Dell. And Tank Dell, 25 years old, so better prognosis there definitely. But with that being said, I'm not really spending a lot of capital on him if it's a dynasty hold or anything like that, or especially in redrafts. He's got to be a later round target, if anything, because like we said, only 33% of players return back to pre-injury performance. There is a risk of re-injury, a risk of soft tissue injuries just based on loading and all of that. So I would use caution when targeting Tank Dell. Najee Harris. So Najee Harris, he was thought to be just immune to long-term injuries. He had been doing so well. He had this consecutive streak of starts and all of that kind of stuff. And then he ended up, unfortunately, tearing his Achilles after he had that eye injury early in the season. So the eye injury wasn't really an issue. He was able to return back. Not really any concerns there. But the Achilles injury, so the problem with that is we saw players like J.K. Dobbins return back to really top-end form following an Achilles rupture, which is relatively rare and unheard of. And the problem with Najee is that he didn't really have too much burst to start with. He was more of like a power back and stuff like that. And with this Achilles tendon rupture, that really affects the power and already limits what little burst he had. So in that situation, even though Najee's only 27, running backs have a relatively short shelf life in the NFL, around 3 to 4 years. And with him having this significant injury and already not having a lot of top end speed, I probably wouldn't be going for Najee Harris. Jayden Daniels has had an unfortunate injury history going on these past couple seasons. So before this, he had a rib fracture, not any long-term concerns there. He also had a knee sprain, not really any long-term concerns there. But what about this elbow dislocation? The elbow dislocation happened on his non-throwing shoulder, and luckily it didn't seem to require any surgical repair. They said there was no ligament damage, which to be honest isn't really possible. If your bone pops out of that socket, there's going to be some ligament damage there because the ligaments are what's holding that bone in place, or at least the articular capsule. So when they say not really any structural damage, that's not really true, but it is good that he didn't require surgery. And with it being on its non-throwing hand, or non-throwing arm, I wouldn't really be concerned about it long term. Wouldn't really affect my prognosis. He's already returning back this week, actually, which is week 15 of the 2025 season for any of you hopefully watching long term from now. Tucker Kraft, he had an ACL injury, doing super well before that as a tight end. And there is a high return to play, along with not a significant performance drop off for players that have ACL injuries. That first season back, though, do expect some performance reduction, ramping up into the later part of the season. So keep that in mind, but long-term wise, not really concerned. Let's talk about some defensive players, though. So Nick Bosa, he basically had a pretty significant injury, unfortunately, but he would return back to pre-injury performance level. They do start, and the problem is with Nick Bosa, I would be concerned about his performance in this kind of situation because defensive players, they require a lot more kind of explosive first step quickness. They require lateral edge rushing for the ability to change directions rapidly and all of that. And with that being said, when you have that kind of ACL injury, you also wonder if they have any kind of meniscus injury or anything like that, like the shock absorbers of the knee. So the good things that he has arguing for him is that he was a high draft pick, and they say that players drafted in the first 4 rounds and also their pre-injury performance really dictates their return. So I would expect Nick Bosa to definitely return back to play, but the studies have shown that even high-end players kind of return back to an average level of performance, and that doesn't really resolve even a couple years after performance. So Nick Bosa should return back to play. He should still be a force, but I would expect a noticeable performance reduction, unfortunately. Joe Mixon has had a lot of drama in this offseason where pretty much didn't play the entire season, and they never released any information about why he wasn't playing. Then the reason that seems to be floating around is that he had some sort of non-football injury with a possible surgical repair outside of the team facility, and it didn't go as well as it could have. With that being said, that's all kind of hearsay. So that was just kind of what I picked up on blogs, on news reports, kind of in the local Texas area and all of that kind of stuff. But the end point is that he had a foot injury in the same foot that he had a pretty significant midfoot sprain a couple of years ago. He recovered back from that midfoot sprain fine, was doing really well. But a recurrent severe injury in that same foot is pretty concerning to me. And I wouldn't really be targeting him with what happened this past season. So keep that in mind. Jalen McMillan, the wide receiver on the Bucs. I'm going to be going over a lot of the Bucs wide receivers, actually. He had a neck injury, and they called it a neck ligament sprain. The major ligament that I would think that would be affected there is called the alar ligament. And the alar ligament is the ligament at the top of the vertebrae that connects to the base of the skull and really is responsible for a lot of skull stabilization, range of motion, kind of stabilization there. When it's sprained, it requires a period of immobilization, as we saw him in that collar. And it heals back well, but it does take a long period of time, about 9 to 11 weeks. And we're seeing Jalen McMillan get activated off of IR this week. and returning back to play. I wouldn't really expect too much out of him this year, but I wouldn't also expect any kind of long-term performance reductions from this. Jonathan Brooks. Really unfortunate story of the year. He was a really solid running back coming out of college, tore his ACL, had it surgically reconstructed prior to starting the NFL, and then he unfortunately retore that ACL on his ramp up. That really doesn't bode well. So running backs that haven't had any NFL experience that have ACLs, they have, reduced performance expectation, but a double ACL tear in the same knee, that's pretty much a worst case situation. And with that said, he can return. It's about probably like a 50 to 60% chance of returning, but performance expectations should be greatly reduced. It wouldn't be someone that I would be targeting or anything like that. In Dynasty, their career duration is significantly shortened, unfortunately. And then they have a higher risk of just other kind of injuries like a contralateral or opposite side ACL injury or something like that. So there's also an accelerated development of post-traumatic arthritis, so it can appear in like 3 to 5 years or something like that. All around, unfortunate situation, someone who I wouldn't really be targeting here. Travis Hunter. So Jags wide receiver, did really well initially. He was playing two ways. They started kind of putting him more toward just wide receiver, and then he started putting up some finally blow up fantasy football point games. But then he ended up getting surgery. And they at first weren't clear with what ligament he injured, but he ended up injuring the lateral collateral ligament, which isn't typically a surgical reconstruction, to be honest. So it must have been a high grade injury. But even with a complete rupture, there isn't any kind of significant performance reduction there. So I would still be okay with Travis Hunter in my lineup. What about Rashawn Slater? Let's talk about some offense linemen. These big boys out here. So he ended up unfortunately having a lower leg injury as well. And the issue here is that left tackles require a significant amount of lower extremity strength and explosive power for pass protection. And with their recovery from these kind of injuries, he would be expected to have a pretty significant reduced output from a patella tendon rupture. Patella tendon is that ligament or that tendon that connects the kneecap to the top of the tibia. And it's not, even though it's in the same area as the ACL, it doesn't show the same great return to pre-injury performance as the ACL reconstructions do. Patella tendon repairs, though, are pretty inconsistent. So there was about a 19-player study that returned back to play after a patella tendon reconstruction. And the range from amount of games played after return ranged from 1 game to 142 games. So we don't really know how Rashawn Slater will perform. A high draft choice, a high-performing individual usually returns back at a higher level than others, so he has a good shot at it. But patella tendon injuries are significant, worse in my opinion than ACL injuries, and something to keep an eye on for permanent reduction in performance. Calvin Ridley, 30 years old, wide receiver. He ended up having a hamstring injury this season. It was an issue, kept him out for a bunch of games, and then he ended up fracturing his fibula after that. Calvin Ridley's had one decent fantasy football performance season. I wouldn't really expect him to be producing at this point in his career, coming back from multiple injuries and not really performing up to snuff prior. Cam Ward might improve. The Titans offense is pretty awful, so the only way the offense can go is up. But Calvin Ridley, I'm not expecting like a huge turnaround from, unfortunately. Josh Jacobs, 27-year-old running back, plays through injuries, battles through injuries, does high output production. This season, he had a bone bruise with a thigh contusion. Nothing that I would really expect to impact him going forward, season over season. So someone that, I would be targeting Dynasty, and I think he's got a couple good years out of him still, even though we talked about before, running backs performance not really great long term. What about Malik Nabers? Malik Nabers is a star wide receiver, New York Giants. He was playing through a turf toe since college, and then ended up unfortunately tearing his ACL. So something that I would definitely expect him to be a little bit reduced this upcoming season. So I wouldn't really be targeting Malik Nabers super high next season in terms of a high output performance, especially in the earlier part of the season. But long-term wise, over a couple seasons, he should be good. Should be able to provide us some pretty good value here. Turf toe, the good thing about it is that it doesn't really show any significant performance reductions long-term wise. ACL does, especially the season afterwards, so that's definitely something to keep an eye on. What about Brandon Aiyuk? So Brandon Aiyuk had a multi-ligament knee injury, and then he just didn't play at all this season for the 49ers. There was some contract disputes, so we don't know how much of it was injury-related versus how much of it was contract-related. With that being said, he's a younger wide receiver. He's in his 20s, and he's got a high talent. He does really well, in my opinion, when he has a full season. He's someone I would target. I think he has a really good upside, and I don't think the injury will significantly limit him. He would be expected to be rusty, though, just not having played for an entire season. Not so much, a little bit combined with the injury. Davante Adams has been pretty durable throughout his career. He went for a stretch from 2021 to 2024 without really any major injuries. Before that, he had a knee sprain. He's had a couple concussions. And then this season, he had that posterior oblique kind of strain that almost kept him out, but then he was able to suit up. Not really any long-term concerns here. As long as he's playing with Stafford, I think he's going to be a great red zone threat, and don't really need to be like that's something that he can continue into his 30s and stuff like that. So I'm okay with Davante Adams injury-wise. Joe Burrow has a history of a scapulae repair. Lit it up after that got repaired. That's that ligament in the hand and the thumb. Can affect grip strength and all of that, but Joe Burrow seemed to have recovered amazingly from that. But then he ended up having a grade 3 turf toe. He ended up getting surgery on that, but he returned back a month early in the same season, which is pretty crazy, and he was doing well already as of week 13. 10-year arthritis risk is something to really keep an eye on because most NFL players, they don't play in the NFL long or up to 10 years or probably at their end of their career, but high-level quarterbacks, they've been shown to play into their 40s. So in my opinion, short-term wise, Joe Burrow is good, but we really have to keep an eye on his risk for early onset arthritis, both in the hand and now in the foot, based on these kind of surgical repairs. But other than that, the next 5 years horizon for him, I think is great. Brock Purdy, talked about this before as well. Turf toe, not really in long-term concerns. He didn't get surgery on it. The risk of early onset arthritis is reduced in that kind of situation. He's been playing decently and stuff like that, so not overall worried about him. Omarion Hampton, talked about how I wasn't super on him this season. Projected that he had a fibular fracture because he was out way longer than what should be for a high ankle sprain. He was in that fracture boot for a lot longer too. Leads to muscle atrophy. So in the same season, I didn't think that he's going to be viable. We'll see what happens this upcoming week 14, I think. 14 or 15. Sorry. Whatever week is coming up, he's returning to play this week, and we'll see how he performs. I think he's got some performance direction throughout the rest of this season, but off-season conditioning should get him back up to form. Trey Benson, this was disappointing. I had really high hopes for Trey Benson. I thought that he was going to come back after that meniscus repair after about meniscus clipping after 5 to 7 weeks and light it up as a RB2. Unfortunately, it seems like he had a setback with meniscus clippings versus meniscus repairs. So meniscus clipping, you can return back within the same season. It usually is something that they just go in, it's quick recovery. The reason why they try and repair it in possible cases is because you don't want to reduce the amount of shock absorber you have in the knee. That increases the bone-to-bone contact, and that increases your risk of early onset arthritis. When you clip out the meniscus, there's more surface area of contact between the tibia and the femur. So that's kind of the rationale behind that. But unfortunately, it didn't work out for Trey Benson because he still isn't practicing even. Most common issue there is reactive synovitis, which is just chronic inflammation that's persisting for some unknown reason. There are ways to calm down the inflammation, but it seems like those aren't working. Aside from that, other concerns that you have there are like an infection, but a septic infection of the joint, he wouldn't even be considered for a turn. Like they would have already ruled him out. There would have been procedures that we heard of and all that kind of stuff. So Trey Benson, long-term wise, I don't know. Having this kind of complication with the knee injury really kind of impacts running back long-term wise. So I would really need to see how he performs next season to really kind of want to take a risk on him. Mike Evans, he ended up getting surgery on the clavicle, and I don't anticipate any kind of issues there. He's returning back this week. But the issue with him is that he has insane hamstring issues. So the first time he had this hamstring injury on the contralateral leg, but previous to this, he had 7 hamstring injuries on another leg. So if you're trying to get Mike Evans, he's a high-risk proposition. He'll probably put up numbers for another couple years, but he's always at risk for missing like 3 to 4 games a year. James Conner, another kind of unfortunate story. He had major knee surgery previously for a possible like ACL injury a couple years ago. Returned back, was doing pretty well, honestly putting up RB1 numbers occasionally, but then he ended up having so they didn't actually phrase what it was, but it was a severe foot injury that knocked him out for a season that required surgery. In almost all cases, that's a Lisfranc injury, as we've seen players like Jayden Reed had a Jones fracture, which is the fifth metatarsal, able to return back, in about 6 to 7 weeks. James Conner was immediately out for the season. That to me sounds like a Lisfranc injury. I really don't know how they're considering J.K. Dobbins to even come back this season with Lisfranc surgery. I don't think that that's really feasible in terms of like a high value output. But with James Conner, his age 32, already has one knee surgery like 3 4 years ago. Now he has a Lisfranc surgery. Risk of early onset arthritis is always there. And he's got soft tissue injuries that have held him out every now and then. So high risk proposition, not really very high on my holds for Dynasty and all that. Garrett Wilson, really, really high level wide receiver, but unfortunately had two injuries this season. He, first of all, had a hyperextension injury of the knee, which puts the PCL at risk and causes a kind of knee sprain. And then later on in the season, he ended up getting a knee bruise where he hit his knee in flexion to the ground, and they said they re-aggravated that and called it a sprain as well. So it sounds like it was a PCL sprain. Long-term wise, he should be good. PCL sprains cause a lot of instability in the short term. We've seen it with multiple players like Drake London and all of that, like holding them out for multiple weeks, Brock Bowers, everything, but wouldn't expect any kind of issues over here with Garrett Wilson or with Brock Bowers or Drake London, to be honest. Sam Laporta. Sam Laporta is an interesting case because he had a back injury that they ended up doing surgery on, but they didn't specify what it was. Two options here. More likely, in my opinion, is what's called a spondylolysis, which is basically a stress fracture of the vertebrae, right at kind of the junction. And if it's worsening, then they'll throw in a screw there to provide some bony scaffolding and shut the player down and allow the bone to heal around that. Not any kind of long-term, despite how serious that sounds, not any kind of long-term performance reductions here. 6 months return around-ish. And aside from that, the other thing could be is a discectomy where you herniated a disc and they clip out that herniated disc that's bulging and pushing out a nerve, causing some persistent symptoms. Not quite as common in the NFL, which is why I was leaning more towards the stress reaction. The stress reaction happens with repeated hyperextension of that spine, which happens a lot when you see these players going up for catches and all of that. Travis Hunter reviewed that about how he shouldn't have any kind of issues with the LCL injuries. Fred Warner, he had an ankle dislocation as well. We talked about how depending on the unimal, bimal, or trimal, that will determine recovery. But with Fred Warner, they didn't really talk about the specifics on what bone he might have fractured or what kind of ligaments he might have injured. So they said there's an outside chance of him returning for the playoffs. So that makes me think it was likely a unimal where he just fractured the fibula, maybe some injury to high ankle ligaments. But can't really say with any significant confidence there. Overall, though, we talked about how defensive ends or defensive players, they rely a lot more kind of on Twitch responses because they're reacting to players. They don't already know kind of what the play's happening. So expect a performance reduction here. Jayden Reed. So in a series of about 25 players that went through Jones fracture, all of them returned to play. None of them showed any kind of significant drop off in performance. So I'm not really worried there for Jayden Reed with his Jones fracture. Clavicle repairs or clavicle fracture healings don't also show any kind of significant performance reductions. Just need to wait for the bone to heal there. Jayden Reed should be good to go. What about Rhamondre Stevenson? So Rhamondre Stevenson had a turf toe condition and he returned back to play. Turf toe, grade 1, not really any concerns long-term wise. Hopefully it won't be too much of a thorn in Trayvon Henderson's side for too long, but injury-wise, I'm not really concerned. What about Cam Skattebo? This is probably the most popular player of the season, to be honest. He had, unfortunately, an ankle dislocation as well, but good news on that is that it seemed to be an isolated fibula fracture with maybe some high ankle ligament damage, but not any kind of significant tibia fractures or anything like that was noted. With that being said, he runs kind of high risk. And he's been saying he's not planning on changing that. So I don't know. Career-wise, I'm a little bit concerned in terms of his production, especially in terms of his re-injury risk. But he should be able to return back by the start of next season and be a viable running back, fantasy football performance-wise by the middle part of the season. That's about it. That's all 31 players, and I hope you enjoyed this rundown. And subscribe, like, follow, all that kind of stuff.